Hello, everyone, and welcome to Building SaaS on AWS. This is the flagship show for Building SaaS on AWS, broadcasted on Twitch. My name is Gunnar Grosch. I'm a developer advocate here at AWS, and if you're building or planning to build a SaaS product, this is the show for you. What we do on this show is we dive deep into SaaS-specific topics so you can learn more about building SaaS on AWS. And every show, well, I am joined by a bunch of expert SaaS builders or topic experts, and then we dive into those topics and let you, our viewers, ask any questions, give comments, and so on. And by the end of the hour, hopefully, we've all learned something new. And this show is a special one because I don't have one guest, I don't have two guests, I have four guests on this time. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Gunnar.
Thank you.
We always do the quick round of introductions, and I think that's super important this time. And Gillian, I want to start with you. Welcome to the show, Gillian.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Gillian McCann, and I'm the CTO of WorkGrid Software. And I've been building SaaS for 6 years, and before that, really focusing on serverless architectures, with integration into the AWS AI services.
And what you didn't mention is that you are also an AWS hero.
I am. I forgot about it.
We did not forget about it.
I am an AWS hero. Yes, I've been a machine learning hero since 2018. And I really like within WorkGrid Software. So we build digital assistant technology for the workplace. And part of that does include AI and conversational experiences. So I focus on applied AI. So I think that's really interesting in the SaaS ecosystem, how to bring some of this into your product.
Great. Welcome, Gillian. So Chris, continue with you.
Yeah. Am I unmuted? Yeah. Hi there. I'm Chris Fregly, Specialist Solution Architecture for AWS. I've been with AWS about almost 4 years now, which is crazy to think about. And most recently focusing on generative AI and large language models and diffuser models for images as well and video.
Welcome, Chris. Akshay?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Akshay Patel. I'm based out of New York City. I'm with the SaaS Factory team. I've actually been with the team a little bit over 3.5 years. My role within SaaS Factory is a principal business lead. Probably not many people know this, but right before I joined AWS, I actually had a vision computing startup in Switzerland. But I've been doing product management for years, been doing SaaS for years. Super excited to be here and talk about this particular topic.
And you might be our first guest ever with more of the business perspective. So excited for that as well.
Indeed.
Welcome you as well. And then Anthony, returning guest.
Thank you, Gunnar. Always a pleasure to be here. Good to meet you, everyone. Hope it's a good day for you all. My name is Anthony McClure, as Gunnar mentioned. I am a solutions architect, also with the AWS SaaS Factory. I've been with the team for just over 2 years, just had my anniversary year recently. So always great to be on the show. Just real quickly about the SaaS Factory for anybody that may be new joining us. The SaaS Factory works with AWS partners to accelerate SaaS application development, do migrations or modernizations as well. We cover all dimensions of an organization's move to SaaS, spanning business, technical, and cultural transformation. And to this end, we also maintain the AWS SaaS Factory Insights Hub, where you can go and find a collection of resources for any stage really of your SaaS journey, including learning resources, reference architectures, and information on how to engage with us. So great to be here.
All right, so welcome all. And well, as you might then guess, based on some of the guests on this show, we are going to talk about generative AI today. And of course, since this is a SaaS show, generative AI and SaaS, and perhaps find out a bit how we can use this somewhat new domain or field together with SaaS. I also want to mention that we, of course, have Bill Tarr joining us in the chat as well. So hi to Bill, and he's going to help us answer questions there. And I already see a bunch of comments. Hi to everyone joining us, posting in the chat, and keep those questions coming all throughout the show. All right, so generative AI. I think we need to start there with perhaps talking a bit about what that is and set the frame for the show, perhaps. So, Chris, maybe, do you want to tell us a bit about what generative AI is?
Yeah. And the funny thing is, all of the customers I work with have suddenly decided to convert all of their machine learning problems into generative problems. So that's my most fun, and I'm sure Gillian can speak to that as well too. That yeah, so I mean, the most obvious would be the creative use cases, the ability to, generate stories, or and there's actually settings when you're using generative AI where you want the generation to be more creative or less creative. And so that has varying degrees of, usefulness. But, some other use cases that pop out, I actually just read an article last night. The Amazon customer reviews have been, it appears that Amazon.com is A/B testing the ability to summarize reviews for a product. And this is funny because I've worked with the Amazon customer reviews data set. It's 150 million customer reviews. And I never really thought about summarizing those reviews per product, but it's actually pretty clever. And so you don't have to read through or pick the 5 and the 4 and the 3 and read all those. You just get one nice condensed summary, and then you can move on to the next product. So yeah, a lot of really cool use cases. People use it for classification, and which seems kind of strange, but you can actually generate the word positive, the word negative, the word neutral, to do sentiment analysis. And yeah, so there's a lot of cool use cases.
Can you just give that sounds both interesting and a bit strange. Can you just tell me a bit more about how that actually works?
Yeah, at the end of the day, this is the dirty secret about generative AI. You feed in a whole bunch of text, and the model just has to predict the next token based on what it's already seen. So when you're kind of training these models or fine tuning them, you're just passing in blobs of data, text, or you've scraped text, or you've grabbed things like Common Crawl, or there's a new data set now called the Refined Web that actually is a very, very cleansed data set that represents like basically the internet. Feed that in, and the model learns to predict the next word. And so when, for example, if you're doing, like code completion, right? So the modern way, things like Amazon Code Whisperer, GitHub Copilot, when you start typing code, it treats that like just a regular generative task where it's going to generate the next, line of Spark code, or the next line of Pandas code or Java code or whatever you got going on. Yeah. So it's actually quite simple.
Yeah, I think that's coming from an expert in the field, of course. Gillian, you want to add on?
Yeah, no, it's exactly that. I bucket it in 2 different ways. It's the generative content, so if your product is focusing on, generating stories, blogs, how can you develop like writing assistants and things that just make it easier for your end user to, essentially do what they do today, but faster, maybe quicker, better. That's the generative side. But the area, and the area we've been focusing on is more what I see as the natural sort of language capabilities, the general capabilities of these models. So yes, zero-shot classification, sentiment analysis, summarization is massive. And that in my head is, how do we make sense of the data that your SaaS may already have access to? So you've got like a lot of unstructured data in the world. How can we use these different techniques? I think what the appeal is to a SaaS and to Workgrid itself is the fact that, potentially this one model, hopefully surfaced through an API, can allow you to explore some of those use cases with your customer, and not have to deploy a model for this and model for that. Now, I think that really predicates on what's your use case, what's your business model, what sort of data. So we talked about, Chris said, trained on the refined or cleansed internet. Like that's a lot of words and a lot of understanding of general knowledge. So depending on your business, you can use that out of the box. We have found that quite successful. But if you are a niche or focused on a particular domain, yes, and we're going to talk about that later, I believe, like how to fine tune it, how to add your content and make it better. So that's, I do see it as those two kind of buckets of generative, and then I just call it I don't know what the correct term is, the general purpose nature of them and the ease of use.
Actually, would be interesting to hear from your side what you're seeing in terms of generative AI.
Yeah, no, indeed. So, Chris, everybody's thinking about generative AI because I think these conversations are also happening at the board, C-suite, and the investor level. So I think the questions with a lot of the customers that we talk to, and in fact, I just got back from the London summit, is what is our story with generative AI? But I think what we see is, the story of AI ML is not new. A lot of our customers have been doing this for some time. And what they're trying to do is discover how else could generative AI really drive business outcomes. So when we're talking about use cases of generative AI, at least from the business sense, it's best to sort of compartmentalize it in a few models. So one model is we're building a product that is using generative AI, and it's building something faster, is delivering text faster, whether it's something like Jasper or for blogs or things like that. But the other one in SaaS specifically, which is more interesting, is how do you further accelerate and optimize SaaS metrics? So an example of that might be, imagine an inside sales team who's prospecting for customers. How do you use generative AI to identify the ideal customer profile? So you're optimizing the way in which you're reaching out to customers. And that's just one example of improving your customer acquisition strategy, right? So it's definitely worth thinking about it as a product or incorporating it into your operational for SaaS efficiencies. So that's the sort of topic areas I'm coming across.
Yeah, I can add to that real quickly too, if you don't mind, Gunnar.
Go ahead.
I actually am working with a customer currently who is in the kind of retail facing space. So it is a SaaS solution, but reaching out to many locations. And they've been a traditional machine learning AI play in the past, and are continue to do so as well, looking at things like computer vision and doing identification based on video and objects that are inside of that computer vision. But what they're finding is that the time to market with those solutions takes quite a while, right? Because they have to typically build models on a per tenant basis. It takes time to get the correct hardware in place to do the computer vision. So the sales cycle is a longer cycle. It takes longer to get there. There's a lot of development and custom work that needs to be done. And even then, once you have all that awesome data that's coming into the SaaS platform, then what do you do with it, right? How do you actually get insights out of that data is kind of the next step, especially when you're dealing with a non-technical audience at the end of the day that is having all these filtered data coming through all these events. How can you shrink that down and put it in a way that's easy for them to be able to understand, to get access to? And that's really where the generative AI piece of this is stepping in. One, the producer can move much faster now because we're dealing with one model. It may have some fine tuning associated with it, but not necessarily even always that, depending on the use case. But they can have the single model that's accessed again in that API way, like Gillian was saying. And the people actually in the end retail solutions stores can work with the model in a natural way too, that they're used to. They can just ask questions, right? And by simply asking natural language questions, they get insights back out of the data. So there's a transformation and a shift happening here, even from customers of ours that are traditional machine learning into the generative AI space.
Chris.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to, build upon that, where I guess one thing I didn't really focus on earlier was the fact that these models are trained on hundreds and hundreds of different tasks, right? So these are multitask models. Mm-hmm. So right from the start, they've been shown examples of how to summarize, how to generate, how to do classification, how to, basically hundreds of different things with thousands and thousands of examples. And so that's where these modern sort of chatbots get all of these capabilities, right? Because they've seen a lot of examples, and they do understand language, right? And so that's very different than sort of the single task machine learning models that we've been dealing with, since the beginning of ML. Yeah, Gillian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, and I do think that is the like the differentiator, as well as the power of the model. It's the access and the capability of them. As Anthony was saying, time to market is really key here. How fast can you explore with your customers some of these new use cases? And if you're not having to train your own model and the whole pipeline and work through that, and you can explore it quicker. I definitely think that's why there's a lot of buzz around it as well. But then also, like, where does this experience get delivered? And Anthony touched on it. We have the rise of the chatbot yet again, different version of a chatbot. But that is one thing. Like, so I've built chatbots for many years. There is key things that never go away, and I think that's as people start to explore the technology that backs a chatbot. The standard engineering practices of analytics and like how's it performing in production and what's the end-to-end experience, because not everybody likes to talk in natural language constantly backwards and forwards. There is widgets and little cards and UI components, so I think the experience of chatbots, like a lot of that foundational stuff still applies, but like I'm gonna say I'm super pumped by the interest that everybody has in this, being able just to converse with a machine. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's good. So there's a lot of talk about the large language models, but also the foundational models. And where do the foundational models come into this? Chris?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Now you're muted.
I've been kind of sick the last couple of days. So, so these foundation models have been pre-trained, right? And these require enormous amounts of GPUs. In fact, Bloomberg recently pre-trained a financial specific multitask language model on some of their proprietary financial data as well as public financial data. And they created what's called a foundation model. Now, at this time, that model's not open source or anything. I don't know if they plan to or not, but so for example, that was scheduled to be about, I think, 1.3 million GPU hours. Now, they were actually able to, I think, do it in about half the time because they were able to find some tricks and realize that the more they were training, it wasn't really helping. This is called early stopping, but this kind of gives you the scale and the number of words that, so like you'll probably hear me and Gillian and like the others talking about tokens and talking about words. Token is like a part of a word or could be a word. And generally it's about 2 to 3 tokens per word. And this is just kind of like the details of the space, but you can chop up words into parts and then reuse those to form other words and things. But to give you a scale, they were training with about 1.4 trillion tokens, which is, if you do the math, multiply by 3, or is it divided by 3? But yeah, anyway, that's a lot of words, right? That's in the trillions of, and to even get this kind of data and get it clean is like very difficult. And by some estimates, I was speaking with some of the Amazon folks recently, and by some like estimates, 1 out of every 100 token that is found on the internet is actually used, because there's just garbage and there's, so sort of on average, if you're getting 1.4 trillion tokens, that means that you had gone through like 100 times that to even get to the 1.4 trillion. So,
but do we see it as these foundation models that they will be something that, well, because not everyone has access to that amount of data, first off, like Bloomberg in this example, or the GPU power to be able to actually process it.
Exactly.
So will that be something like offered as a service to get access to these different models?
Yeah, that's right. So within SageMaker, we have something called the Jumpstart Foundation Model Hub. And then we are also working on a service called Bedrock that was like announced. I think it's in private preview now. It'll be GA hopefully later in a few months. And yeah, that's right. These are either ways to get access to these. Like the term Model Hub comes up all the time. We work very closely, or at least I work very closely with a company called Hugging Face that has essentially this massive, think of them as like GitHub for foundation models, and they have data sets, and they have all the data sets that were used to train those foundation models. So you could actually mix and match, grab the refined web data set that's very clean, train it on another foundation model. But to be very clear, it's not likely that like most of us on this call, including myself, will ever train a model from scratch and train our own foundation model. That's a very rare thing because it does require 1.2 million GPU hours and all that. So you would start with the foundation model, feed it in just your domain specific data, what's called fine tuning, and then out comes a version of these chatbots or these like language models or the stable diffusion, these like image video models that knows our specific domain. Yeah, that's usually how it goes. So fine tuning.
I did have a question which comes up quite often, and I'll bring it from the business lens, right? So if you look at use cases like financial data, say Bloomberg, right? There's one thing training foundational models to really build, generative AI use cases. But what's the opinion of, or what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of real-time use cases, right? So financial LLMs or foundational models for stock trading, right? You're ingesting so much data. So how should the tech team talk to the business teams about real-time versus querying or using already pre-trained data? It's kind of an interesting tension over there, but it's kind of interesting to kind of bring in that business tech conversation.
Yeah, I'll speak to that first, and maybe Chris or Gillian can weigh in too. But it's an interesting concept because obviously this is going to be very API driven in the future, right? I think that's where everything ultimately is going. Whether that is using a service like a Bedrock, the AWS will be presenting, or actually hosting your own, right? So those are kind of the two different ways, but then wrapping an API service around that. Once you have an API, then of course you can start acting with these models programmatically, which would feed in, I think, actually to the real-time scenario that you're talking about here. But there's still a lot of challenges that go along with that, right? Inference, which is the process of actually accessing the model and getting data from it, is also not free, right? It takes in some cases a significant amount of hardware and capability to operate against the model once it's produced in an efficient and quick process. So latency, for instance, becomes a really big question, especially if you're dealing with something like financial data or stock analysis in real time. The volume of data is huge. And then there's also just the limitations ultimately too of how much information you could feed in a query to the model, right? That the actual physical size of the amount of data that can go into the model when you're doing the query to get the request back is an issue too. And again, if we're dealing with, let's say, the stock market and analyzing a huge amount of data at once, you would need to have an appropriate model set up, and again, a large enough inference size to be able to accept all of that information at once to then give you a result back. So there's some real challenges there. I think that is really the future, where we will get to. But how we go from where we are today to that point, that's a big, a big question mark, I think.
So, Gillian, I'm not sure if you want to add on something.
Yeah,
to
no,
that
I was just gonna sort of say that, like, I do some of the points there on latency, especially, so I haven't focused on financial data, it's very much text data, but you do see, a real-time interaction, you've got the latency of the model itself, especially if you're asking for generative content, you have to build that into the end user experience. Because it looks pretty bad when you're sitting waiting for 5 seconds for something to come back. So you kind of have to think about that from the end user. So I do think latency is an issue. And then, you have a large language model trained on data, but do you want to pull in real time data from a third-party system? And you've got multiple integrations then happening. So again, yeah, latency is an issue, how you deliver that to the end user. And then the token size is into the APIs itself, which is what Anthony's alluding to. We're starting to see the rise of semantic search. It seems to be back in business. There's a lot around embeddings and vector databases. Like they're not new in a way. It's just much more, I think, accessible, and people are really exploring that space as well because of the restrictions of the token size. I think really is where those I'm going to say they're new patterns emerging, but it's not new technologies in a way, because embedding models have been there for a while. Yeah,
we're gonna see a big spike in usage of vector databases. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So if you just joined us, this is Building SaaS on AWS, and today we are talking about generative AI and SaaS. And we've talked a bunch about generative AI so far, so maybe it's time to talk a bit more about the SaaS part of it. And maybe, Anthony, this is a question for you, but what sort of use cases can you see right now coming up from SaaS customers?
Yeah, I certainly let Akshay maybe weigh in this too, because I know he's kind of tied into this. But in general, there's a selection of them, and they're very similar to what we've been talking about as far as machine learning in general happen to be too, right? So if you distill it down to kind of a high level, we first start with the model as a service. And I think that's really an area where generative AI specifically is going to really fit well because of that generalist nature of how generative AI works. So in a model as a service situation, with your SaaS product or service that you're creating, you would simply have, as part of that service, as part of that product, an implementation of an LLM, a generative AI of some sort that would be interacted with by your tenants, just like they would any other feature of your application. But the key thing here is that you're not really necessarily adding domain-specific information on a per-tenant basis to that model, right? The model is more generic and is just kind of used. That's I would say is going to be a very large use case in the near-term future that really covers a lot of different bases, almost maybe to a detriment. We've joked around, a little bit about how generative AI is going to become kind of the hammer to hit every nail when it comes to machine learning because it's quote unquote easy. But in reality, of course, that's not always the best solution to do. But that would be one. The second use case is where you do need to add in domain-specific information on a per-tenant basis, right? So in the past, if we were dealing with traditional ML, this would be creating a model per tenant that would be trained up, that is specific to that tenant, specific to their data, specific to their use cases. You're still having a multi-tenant application in this case from a SaaS standpoint, but you're actually deploying endpoints for their specific model to their users. We do have some of that capability as well in the large language world, in the generative world, where you can start with a foundation model and then create almost a subset model, a smaller model where you don't have to have these millions of GPU hours to train up the fine tuning essentially for a particular tenant. I think maybe Chris will go into a little bit about that later on, about how we actually do that, because it's very, very cool. And I believe has large implications for SaaS providers specifically when needing to do things that are very specific on a per tenant basis. So that would be, again, the model per tenant use case. And then the third one, I think, is what Akshay was alluding to a little bit earlier. And that is, how can you use machine learning in general, but then generative AI specifically, to help you actually operationalize your business, right? If you're a SaaS provider, how can I use all of this data that I'm gathering from the entire landscape of all of the customers that I have in my as tenants as part of my solution, and gain insights and information on how to make my business as a SaaS provider better, right? That actionable intelligence, as I like to call it. That is a large open area that we're all talking about, but we're not exactly sure how to implement just yet. So this is kind of a call out, I think, to the community as well. If you are a SaaS provider or a solution provider out there that's using these technologies to help to accelerate your own business in these ways, we would love to hear about it. So definitely reach out to the SaaS Factory if you're in this category, or if there are other use cases that your businesses are having and identifying from a SaaS provider. We're really trying to build up our own knowledge base as well. We're all learning kind of at the same time here in these new technologies of how we can better then help the community to provide guidance around this. But Akshay, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, no, I think you summarized it quite well. Just wanted to kind of double click into how do you think about that as a SaaS builder, right? So if you look at the example of model per tenant, I think there are plenty of use cases if you're a healthcare provider doing ERP, the ERP, EHR solutions, or if you're someone like a CRM, building CRM-like solutions or CMS solutions, because you're generating a lot of data per customer. And I think in those particular cases, when you think about the technology, the business angle to that is the security aspect as well, right? A lot of the customers and builders are saying, if there is, when do I choose a model per tenant, or when do I choose general model per service? I think it really depends on the use case that you're building, whose data you're generating, and what are some of the legal things you got to think about as you start incorporating some of these technologies, right? So those are the two differences between model as a service and model per tenant. In the operations as a SaaS provider, I think there are plenty, right? Even if you think about Code Whisperer, how do you 10x a developer to generate more output and throughput? I think it's going to create some really interesting and perhaps even force us to rethink the way we build organizations and deliver value to customers. So it's definitely a new and interesting things I've been seeing in industry, but it's a great summary of how to really think about it.
Yeah, there's one more area too, and this is a burgeoning area that I know of. In a previous life that I had an opportunity to work with, but I think it's going to expand as well. And that is this idea of consortium data. And what I mean by that is, if you're a SaaS provider and you have many tenants that have their own data, as a part of the solution that the SaaS provider is building, there can be an agreement made with the tenants to actually belong to a consortium and therefore provide the data that the tenant is actually generating from their customers or their users to a larger data set that exists across all tenants. And then from there, the entire consortium itself can have machine learning or generative AI that is built on top of that much larger data set that covers multiple tenants in this case, to provide a greater for the whole behind it. Now, as Akshay was alluding to, obviously there's a lot of legality that goes along with something like that. There has to be approvals and what exact data and how do you handle all the PII that goes along with something of that nature. But that is another area that I see as a potential use case that will grow into the future, specifically with SaaS providers, because of the nature of the data that exists within them.
So we have a question from John in the chat. So one topic I'm interested in, if Gen AI forms part of your product, how do you go about debugging it or avoiding weird emergent behaviors?
Oh boy. Oh yeah. So this is the hallucinations and some of the fine-tuning process. Okay, so like stepping back, if you just grab a plain foundation model off the shelf, you have to understand which data set, right? Yeah, has that been trained on? Yeah, am I back? Okay. Yeah, which data set has that foundation model been trained on? Is it an instruct model? So, right, the instruct models are specifically trained where you give instruction and the model then kind of knows, what bounds it's supposed to stay in. Now, there's this whole field called prompt engineering that is like both mysterious and, like cool sounding at the same time, where even things, if you don't do any fine tuning, you could still try to control what the model responds with just by putting in like phrases in your prompt, which is what you ask, think of like a chatbot, you're like typing something in. And you could say, my favorite one recently was, answer the following question in the voice of Gossip Girl from 2008. It was this American TV show based out of New York, and it's this like fast talking, like cosmopolitan girl, and she's like super funny. And it actually does that. You can put, so those are some of the fun things. Where you start to see the hallucinations is if you get a model that has not been properly fine-tuned, right? And yes, I keep kind of skipping here. Can you all still hear me?
We can still hear you. You just look a bit frozen.
Am I frozen?
As long as we can hear you.
Okay. I have the Mac beach ball of death going on here, so yeah, I'll just keep talking. Yeah. Right. So, fine-tuning helps, prompt engineering helps. The other really bad thing that can happen, obviously, is bias and just the data from the internet is not always the most clean and nice data, right? There's a lot of hate speech out there, and so one of the things I spend a lot of time with my customers working on these days is something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So this is a type of fine-tuning that goes beyond just the instruction fine-tuning or fine-tuning on your specific domain, but it can actually look at the responses and sort of soften them up a little bit. And most recently I used a model out of Facebook called the Facebook hate speech model, which is basically a binary classifier that you pass in the response from the model, and it tells you whether or not that response contains some kind of hate speech. That then gets fed in through reinforcement learning, and throughout this process you can actually detoxify or lower the toxicity of your specific model. And we're starting to see this now. I think the Bing by Microsoft, I just read an article the other day where it seems like they jumped the gun a little bit and released Bing Chat, and it started generating really bad things, so they had to kind of back off a little bit. So yeah, this is still a problem even with these really large companies that have a lot of researchers.
Yeah, I mean, I could add to that slightly. So I mean, we are focused more on that in context learning, as we're trying to push that as far as we can until we have to fine tune, just for cost and getting something out the door to explore. So I do think that's important. But the thing to take a step back is core engineering practices still apply. It's just a different type of technology. So how do you test it? I think the confidence that if you're looking for, so we're focusing on instruction based. What's your instruction? What's your prompt? How do you iterate on that to improve it slightly? How do you test that? Where do you get that test data from? So there's like trying to explore, there's a lot of frameworks being built around this. So like things that we're doing is, could you use the models themselves to generate synthetic test data? Pretend you're in these scenarios. What would a person say? Because when in the world of chatbots, people say really random things, even though it's supposed to be about like HR. You do go off on tangents. So kind of like that test data, and just just talk about machine learning, your test and training data. Like, we're not really training it. In context learning is just at that point in time, but just iterating around the prompts, like building some test harnessing and like just running it. We're getting 99% confidence. We get that structure back. That's great. That's what we'll roll with. But like, that's what I'm getting at. Like, it's well architected. It's tests and things like that. In this whole new world, don't forget all that.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit more, right? So if you think about what Gillian said initially about the user experience, and it's all about, before you get to debugging, you got to start with the user experience and what is it you're trying to do. So if you look at examples like HubSpot, who've built this chatbot for their support cases, the user experience actually has the top prompts already built in. You just click and it sort of automatically populates. So starting with what is the business case and use case you're trying to solve is probably one of the best starting points. But there are other generative AI companies like Perplexity. What they've done is they've taken the tokens and then they sort of show it up in their UI where some of this information is coming from. And I think what I'm also seeing is this emergence of an AI ops, right? We put an ops next to everything in SaaS, right? FinOps, SaaS ops. I think there's AI ops, which becomes part of the business model, which is what is the inputs and prompt engineering or outputs that you're seeing, and then how do you actually look at this data and build metrics around it and teams around it to really be able to respond to it quickly, right? And I think this hallucination piece, which is interesting as a word, if you look at under the hood of generative AI, it's all predictive. The mathematics and the science behind it is predictive. So if you understand that, I think it's a great place to start with the foundational model of what you're building as you start thinking about debugging.
So Chris is reconnecting, I believe. It was nice to see him be very still for a while, but hopefully he'll be back shortly. So Chris touched on the topic of fine-tuning in reference to John's question, and good question, by the way. So Anthony, maybe you can give some insights on what fine-tuning is, and Gillian as well, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris is definitely the expert here. So when he jumps back in, maybe he'll be able to go into a bit deeper. But absolutely. So since we are dealing with such large models in this case, and as we talked about earlier, the process of being able to train these, even as a large organization, can be excessively expensive, right? Just the amount of GPU time is so big. What we do instead, or what we can do instead, to add in that domain-specific information to an existing foundation model is to enhance that model with think of it like a sub-model, essentially, that is built then specifically with your domain-specific information. And there's an acronym. It is PEFT, P-E-F-T. And Chris, as far as what the acronym for PEFT is, I don't remember what it exactly stands for. All these things change constantly, but this overall concept is that instead of taking the billions of parameters, right, that are part of the large language model itself, you take a subset of those, and then you build that around your actual domain specific information. And instead of spitting out a model once it's completed that's in the many gigabytes in size, you spit out a model that's in the megabytes in size instead. So it takes a lot less training to do all of that fine tuning with. And then when you're accessing the model or actually doing inference against the model, it's a combination of the two together, right, that actually gets you the information that is domain specific. But so Chris, since you're back, I see. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Gunnar.
So PEFT, or parameter efficient fine-tuning, if I can show off a bit.
Yes, excellent. There it is.
Sounds quite important when we're talking about SaaS or multi-tenant SaaS solutions. So Chris, please continue about PEFT.
Yeah. And can you see and hear me? Okay. Yeah, you're all not.
And you're moving. You're moving.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. You were all frozen too. So yeah, we were just stuck in time. I looked the goofiest, so yeah, had to recover. Parameter efficient fine tuning. Can I share my screen for a sec?
Oh yes.
Let's get this going on here. Okay, so the reason why this is important for SaaS is if you're so let's say you have 10,000 tenants. These language models, these foundation models that you plan to fine tune, these things are billions of parameters, right? And I mean, like the smallest usable models are like 7 billion parameters, and so like 32 bits is 1 byte, and so multiply that by 7 billion, and you've got like gigabytes and gigabytes. So when you're trying to service 10,000, tenants, you like just on disk, you need a whole lot of disk, like just to store the models. Now with something like parameter efficient fine tuning, which is called PEFT, and this is actually one of the most common types of PEFT, called LoRa, which is another goofy acronym, but it stands for low rank adaptation. Now, if you're familiar at all, if you remember back in the sort of mathematics days in high school or college, there's something called singular value decomposition. And if you're cringing and the terms like eigenvalues and eigenvectors, yeah, like don't worry too much about it. The intuition here is we can actually fine tune and create a really, really thin, what's called LoRa adapter per tenant. Now these are on the order of 10 megabytes, 15 megabytes, and that represents the fine-tuned variant for each tenant. So now I have 10,000 of those times 10 megabytes is a whole different story than 10,000 times these like 1 gigabyte, like 5 gigabyte models. And at the same time, we can also train these on a lot smaller resources. So I mentioned during pre-training, during Bloomberg pre-training, that they required 1.3 million hours of like GPUs. Well, now that I'm doing sort of singular value decomposition, it's not exactly the same thing, but I can actually represent certain parts of my neural network with these really skinny long matrices that, when multiplied together, get me an approximation of what the full matrix would look like. So huge, huge savings. What we're doing is actually freezing the foundation model. That's the really big one. And just training this really, really small 10 megabyte set of weights. And, this is literally this width of these, and for these skinny matrices is 4, and, 4 columns of data, 4 rows of data. And so 4, 8, 16, 32, with that small amount of data, I can actually service many, many thousands of customers. And then when I go to actually serve the model in production, I take the frozen base model, that's the, like multi-gigabyte model, and I just insert this really, really small 10 megabyte LoRa like adapter into that base model, and then I can serve that customer. So I can use the same base model and just swap in the tenant specific. And so, this paper came out, I think, a year or two ago, and everyone, all of my customers, especially the SaaS customers, have moved to this.
Yeah, I see an upcoming episode on the horizon specifically about this. We usually have a pretty technical show, but this is almost next level. Very interesting. But we have a bunch of good questions in the chat. I want to make sure that we get to those as well. So let's see. First one is from Rosenman. What measures are required to ensure security when using generative AI? I think we can talk about it both in general and from a SaaS perspective.
A couple things that pop into my mind real quick would be for something like the code generation, where it's generating source code. I know there's been a lot of there's actually lots of lawsuits happening right now. I heard of a big one in Colorado here in the U.S. where if you capture somebody else's code and train it and use it for your model, and now you're generating their code, that's more of a kind of legal thing, but from a security standpoint, something similar. So the way that they've been getting around the code generation legality stuff is when you generate something, or at training time, you are pulling in the metadata as to which GitHub repo, for example, this came from. And so when it generates code, it can then also include the attribution. That seems to be the most common, but
And
Yeah.
Anthony, from a SaaS perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost, we have to go back to what Gillian said earlier, right? Is that general engineering best practices still come into play no matter what it is that we're dealing with, right? So if we are, for instance, creating a path LoRa-based adapter, right? Obviously, that model is then specific to that tenant. So there's a tenant isolation that goes along with that. We of course have content out there about how best to, in a general machine learning sense, I should say, how best to handle deployment of model endpoints and things of this nature. I think a lot of that still applies here. Of course, utilizing security best practices for the generation of the actual output of the training of that model. So securing an S3 or whatever data store that you are putting that into on a per tenant basis. All of those general security best practices for SaaS come into play here as well. I think there's also the other side of this, which is the inference side, right? Which is a question too. And it really depends on what the use case happens to be. If the inference is going to be in a throwaway sense, as far as the content that's being provided by the end user or the application it's calling the API, where it's it's a query and then it's done and you're not storing that, then the isolation story isn't necessarily as huge, but you should still be treating the resources as if it is a pooled model, essentially, right? Because it is a shared model that you would ultimately be going up against. But what happens if you want to then store those prompts, right? Maybe you want to keep a history of those prompts. So again, now we're talking about traditional tenant isolation, and where that data is ultimately being kept is something that would come up and you need to take thought to. Addition to that, in many cases, when you're generating a prompt, especially when it's domain specific, or you're talking about some kind of content that is related to an individual tenant, there are going to be other services that are involved that actually build that prompt, right? It's not just the information that is being provided by the end user or the software that's calling the API itself, but also external data that is going to be injected or become a part of that actual prompt that is going to go in to be doing the inference. So in that case, tenant isolation is very important, right? Because we may be querying a database table or a DynamoDB table or any number of resources in order to get that extra metadata information to go and build out that prompt to go then into the query that ultimately come out from the model. So yeah, all of those general security, tenant isolation best practices that we've been building up over the years absolutely still apply and should be applied when talking to a generative AI model.
Gillian, I want to hear from you. Are there any specific security concerns or measures that you've taken in your work at the moment around generative?
Yeah, I think to all the points raised definitely resonate. I think the things we're getting asked is more maybe on a privacy perspective. Concerns like, if you're using a large language model in your product, which model? Like, there's a lot more questions. So, take a step back. We use a wide range of AWS services, but we get a lot of questions on specific services, like how's our data being used, and so just having like a clear understanding of your model that you're using, and if you're using a third party provider, their position, their SOC, their privacy, data being used. So it's that whole, like, is our data being used? Where is it? Can I see what's being sent into the prompt? That's something we're sort of hearing a wee bit more of. I'd like to know a wee bit more under the covers, which ultimately is the architecture of your product, but to provide that sort of, what's the word? Like, to help people understand how it's working, to give them confidence that
right.
you're not doing something crazy, as maybe there is more customer facing analytics, or exposing some of the inputs and outputs for a security team to review and things like that. So that's kind of like, we're hearing that a wee bit. It's a new technology, so people are maybe less comfortable in certain areas, so we just have to make sure that we're matching what our customers are asking for. There is something that we haven't touched upon, and I'm not sure if like other people are hearing that. For a very large customer, bring your own model. in the same way that people are like, bring your own key. Sort of, is that something people are saying when we talk about tenant isolation? You know, is that something larger companies are sort of suggesting in other SaaS? So that's maybe a question for, you know, the SaaS Factory guy. Like, what are they seeing out there?
So
Yeah.
I think, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I have an architecture diagram that actually, you know, I'm on the ML side and the generative AI, but I work with the SaaS Factory folks to, and so this actually comes out of a workshop. And yeah, Anthony, your people, you know, rocked it out over there, because we actually use this on a customer with a large number of tenants. And so here you see tenant isolation all the way from, you know, the initial kind of gateway. So think of this as where you're sending in maybe your pictures of yourself because you want the service to generate some sort of avatar that, you know, looks like you see all over the internet now. People have these AI generated avatars. I did one for my dog the other day, that kind of thing. And so all the way through, this is using SageMaker, which is the service that I spend a lot of time on. And so all of this is all locked down at, you know, S3, all of the AWS services, all the way through, you know, to these SageMaker pipelines, which then train or actually do the fine tuning. And so keep in mind, by the way, fine tuning only requires, in some cases, 5 images. And you can, you know, that model, because it's been trained on so many other images, because it's a foundation model, can actually pick up what your dog looks like and can generate like a pencil sketch version of your dog or a pencil sketch version of yourself. And so all of this, all the way through down to when you're actually calling, you know, so tenant A or like user A wants to actually, you know, like retrieve those avatars. So yeah, this is all locked down and part of SaaS Factory. Yeah.
Yeah, and Bill, maybe if you can put in some links into chat about the architectures that we've laid out here on the multi-model, single and multi. We have several different things out there as far as deploying. But yeah, to your point, Gillian, absolutely. I think we do see this as, you know, something that's happening now. How that plays in specifically to SaaS, I don't think we've seen as much just yet. But I would not be surprised, especially moving into the generative AI world, where customers of a SaaS provider that is giving access to these much larger LLMs, these large generative models, would allow their customers to then maybe create their own fine tuning, right, based on their resources to the SaaS provider, and then upload that some way and have to integrate it. So, yeah, the future will be an interesting place, I think, when it comes down to it and everything shakes out regarding these technologies.
And I think that's a great thing to end on, because we are reaching top of the hour. Sometimes when we do this, I let everyone do add the last thing, but that usually takes 10 minutes because no one on these calls can keep it short. But I am going to ask Gillian to just, in a few sentences, just say, what do you think is going to be the next thing here? What do you see is going to happen next, or what you guess is going to happen next, Gillian? Putting you on the spot.
Putting me on the spot. Multi-model architecture.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Oh, that was brief. That's great. All right. Well, let's end on that note then. Multi-model. What did you say?
Multi-model architecture. Yeah.
All right. So with that, I want to thank the audience, all of the viewers. I want to thank my guests today, Gillian, Anthony, Akshay, Chris. Thank you all for joining. It's been an interesting and very fun discussion about generative AI and SaaS, and thanks to Bill in the chat as well. All right, and with that, thank you all for joining, and hope to see you again in 2 weeks for our next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.